Goedenavond, bonsoir, good evening. So I will speak in English. Just a few words to introduce the conference. So I'm not the star tonight. So this is there are the stars, our European panel. I'm really proud of to have like 4 nationalities in front of you. This conference, Eurotopia, is organized by the Alliance Française Amsterdam in the framework of the festival, which started last Monday, so last week, and which will continue until Sunday. So we are very happy to welcome you tonight. This conference is organized in collaboration with SPAO 5&20, SPAO 25, and in collaboration with Arte as well. So I'm really glad to have the support of Arte tonight. So the idea of this festival is to have various disciplines, concerts, debates, conferences, kids workshops, documentaries, and which would gather all the people which are interested by French language, French culture. So please enjoy, and I give the word to Antoine Moutot. Antoine Moutot is a French journalist. He lived in the Netherlands for 7 years. He's correspondent for Arte, but not only. Please, Antoine, merci.
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you as well thanks to the Alliance Française and SPAO 5&20 for the organization of this event. So one of the main topics of this of tonight's conference is the way utopias and sorry, I don't know if you can hear me better now. The way utopias and utopian narratives are taking their place in a world in crisis we are living in now. But first of all, I would ask all of you what place do utopias and utopian narratives occupy within your specialty, your work? Louisa.
Okay, so as a political geographer, or better yet, as somebody who's worked on geopolitics and geopolitical imaginations for most of my career, I think both those notions come very directly together. I mean, geopolitical imaginations, geopolitical visions are always about envisioning different worlds, sometimes utopian, sometimes not. And especially, I mean, my work has focused on European foreign policy, European geopolitics, which in a way has been a work of building a different, I don't know if you want to call it utopian, vision of what geopolitics could be, but certainly moving beyond, kind of the classical geopolitics that Europe was known for and that led to all the disasters that we know. And this has been over the past couple of decades, and certainly, as all of you will be aware, the idea of a geopolitical Europe by now is common sense. I mean, the current commission calls itself for the first time a geopolitical commission, and kind of thinking also of the French presidency of the EU right now, this question has been very present. So that's one part of where I think I would place myself in thinking about utopias, European or otherwise. The other part is in looking at how Europe relates itself to the rest of the world. The other important part of my work has been on European borders, European border policy, European migration policy, where, let's say, these ideal visions very quickly and very directly clash with not so, let's say, utopian and not so ideal practices on the ground. So I think, that has always been a very interesting site to examine, the interaction of these utopian ideal visions and territorial realities, let's put it that way.
And Florian.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm a cultural scholar by trade. So first and foremost, I mean, originally I studied literary studies, and there utopias are obviously, you're at the core of utopia, so to speak, because utopia started out as a literary philosophical project by Thomas More in 1516. And what I find interesting about this in connection with the topic for tonight, with European utopias, and what my research focuses on is how these cultural origins still translate into what we do nowadays with utopias. Utopias are narratives, right? They're stories we tell ourselves and we tell other people, and they are a particular kind of stories. They are future-bound stories. choice, you could say, and therefore they're particularly risky. So if you allow me to very abstractly, briefly state what in the abstract, what is a narrative? So a narrative is we take something from the complexity of life, right? We take certain things out of that, we interconnect them, and the result of this we use to make sense of life, basically. So if someone asks you, what have you done yesterday? You won't tell them like all the 24 hours of yesterday, because then you would probably need 24 hours. But you pick out certain events and you interconnect them and make a whole new, like, this was my day, kind of sense-making activity, right? When it comes to utopias, as I said, all these processes, so selecting, putting together, making sense, are future-bound, are related to the future. They're promises, you could say critically. And promises also run the danger of not becoming true after all, right? So this is what Thomas More actually kind of included as a big pun in the very notion, the very word of utopia. So he was the one who invented the word utopia. And it's actually a mixture of the two Greek terms, eutopos, fittingly with our topic for tonight, which means a good place, right? So rather than Eurotopias, we could have said Utopias to express this kind of hope we all have. And ootopos, which means no place at all. So that danger of like utopias not becoming true is something that is always carried, and also through political, social utopias. And of course, the EU has plenty of these in their history, right? So we have the no more war, the basic grand promise after the Second World War, no more war on European grounds, that is, and we know that this has not quite worked out. We have, more recently, of course, for instance, the motto of the European Union, right? Unity in diversity, which is not only a utopia, but also, if not a paradox, then say a tension field, right? Because the decisive question is, of course, where does unity end and diversity start, and the other way around. So there's plenty of that, even though I have the impression, and that's something I'm working on right now, that the utopias are kind of in the defense more and more. I mean, if we all think of it, when was the last time we have heard a proper European utopia, so to speak? Just as an analytical statement, not so much as something that I would criticize or condemn or whatnot. I rather think we're now in an age in European politics in many regards that are more tending towards reconstructive or even reactionary narratives, like reactionary in the truest sense of the word, that we react to crisis, we react to COVID, we react to wars and say, okay, we have to re-establish our new normal or normality, and also reactionary in the political sense of re-establishing, keeping, right, protecting, etc. And I think there's a strong danger in this moving away from utopia, with all the criticism that can come with utopia. So that's it in a small nutshell.
And thank you. And Dimitris, how does it apply to your own specialty, or
right,
is it connected to it? Yeah.
I'll tell you. I'm a political scientist by training, but a sociologist sort of by choice. So it's really practices I'm interested in, specifically radical envisionings from below. It's from the streets. So my research interests are twofold. So on the one hand, I'm looking at specifically the anti-austerity movements of 2011, the movement of the squares, and their political imagination, what remains of it 10 years onward, and what's part of their envisioning. And here I'm referring to the solidarity movements, I'm referring to neighborhood assemblies, I'm referring to direct democratic practices that are, in a way, an answer also to the crisis of democracy in the aftermath of the financial crisis. On the other hand, I'm also interested in the limits, if you will, of emancipatory practice in contemporary societies. So this is to say that such concepts that previously were classically non-economic concepts, such as creativity, happiness, solidarity, common good, the social, if you will, we're sort of trying to address these issues and solve issues pertaining to them through market-based logics, drawing from efficiency maximizing, utility maximizing, profit maximizing contact. So my question is, what happens if we address emancipatory issues and projects by market mechanisms? What happens to the idea of solidarity if it's governed by competitive markets? What happens by such opaque practices as social innovation, social impact measurement, design thinking? What happens if we use these in order to transform society. So what kind of, vision of the future are we looking at? Yeah, so in a word, it's the economization, capitalization, entrepreneurialization of emancipatory practice. But it's really this twofold thing, because I think we need to understand what we're against in order to be able to understand, what radical imaginings are possible.
All of you already started to point it out a bit already, but the European Union is already facing some big challenges. Already it's facing some big challenges right now, some big crises, as all of you probably know. What is the relationship between crisis and utopia?
And utopia. Well, I'll pick up on what Florian said about, the rush to restore or to reactionary narratives, because I think, very often, utopias, certainly, political envisionings or geopolitical envisionings are born in times of crisis, because they provide, these reassuring narratives, and they also help make sense of the world. And I think, the definition that you gave of narratives in general is really, really helpful. And it's the narratives, the personal narratives that we use to make sense of the world around us, but it's also the narratives taken forward by states and also by actors such as the EU. And the world is not just a perilous one, and with many dangers, or at least that is the way it is described. It is also difficult to make sense of, because these dangers are in many ways new, and yet we try to somehow fit them into our older narratives, nevertheless. So, this kind of recycling of imaginaries in the geopolitical sense, and the EU, unfortunately, I think has been navigating this. So on the one hand, trying to do something different, but the temptation, and it's being pushed that way as well, because just think what has happened over the past 2 months of the war, and we are 2 months into this war, right? The calls for a stronger, in terms of very much of hard power European Union, in the terminology of Cold War geopolitics. It's really, we're going back to a language and imaginations that are completely unsuited for today, and that the EU as an actor cannot simply fulfill. So it's also a mismatch. And yet these are the imaginaries that I think we find familiar, we find reassuring. So I think, again, back to your point of trying to make sense of the world and to kind of pin things down with words, with maps that we recognize, I think it's a very powerful one. But especially this, kind of how moments of crisis generate this. And I think there's multiple crises taking place right now. So, I would also go back to the notion of solidarity that Dimitris noted, but I think, maybe we can save that for a second round.
Later on.
Yeah.
And Florian, how do you see it?
Yeah, I would add to that wonderful collection of how to evade expressing utopian narratives, so to speak, or creating them, to maybe with 2 more moments in that regard, which are also very closely connected to crisis scenarios. So I think what the European Commission has been doing over the past couple of years was finding new ways of not too directly top-down, so to speak, try to order people how they should conceive Europe and what the utopia of Europe might be. But for instance, they have tried to, excuse the neoliberal metaphor here, they've tried to outsource it, so to speak. There's been initiatives like a new narrative for Europe, for instance, some 10 years ago, right, where cultural practitioners, intellectuals were asked to come up with their own ideas by the European Commission, which is great, which is interesting. It shows, really, as I said, or for me, it shows this kind of evading the crisis of top-down or perceived top-down politics. Sometimes they've also tried to suggest that utopia has already come with rather devastating results, I would think. I'm thinking of this affair in end of 2019 when the new president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, rebranded the commissioner names, and the name for the commissioner who's responsible for migration, amongst other things, Margrethe Schinas, was rebranded as the Commissioner for Protecting Our European Way of Life. And then there was a shitstorm, and in the end they changed it to Promoting Our European Way of Life.
Much better.
Yeah, much better, because the European way of life is still there. So what is it, right? I mean, obviously, so this kind of seemed to suggest that, yeah, well, the utopia has come and we haven't all realized it, but the European way of life is already there. It's also a bit of a cheesy copy-pasting from the American way of life you could add there. But so I think these are some of the strategies related to, well, rather utopia avoiding, so to speak, in these realms. And I would also add, of course, coming back to your question, like how does utopia relate to crisis? I mean, a simple answer would be it provides, if not an answer, then a promise for a way out of a crisis, which is, again, ingrained in the terms. I'm not saying that etymologies or the history of terms always speaks a deeper truth, but also in the case of crisis, this is originally a term that denotes like the climax of an illness, right? So this is the decisive moment. Crisis means decisive moment. It can go both ways. And obviously the utopian positive notion or imaginary you might have there is that it goes in the right way, so to speak. So there would be chances for developing utopias there. But again, it's a risky business to promise too much, right?
And do you share like the same point of view about on this really last one part, first of all?
I think I would really like to sort of pick up on the idea of the American way of life as the capitalist imaginary, sort of the promise of capitalism and how this has been failing for the last 10 years and what this tells us about the relationship about crisis and utopia. I mean, this idea of capitalism that if we work hard and, you know, we compete for middle-class belonging, we'll make it to relative success has been failing with, like, you know, in so many ways. Scholars have been talking about the crisis of the imagination, of the never-ending nightmare, the fact that there's no future. So I think this really relates to the idea so how do you envision utopias if your imagination is in crisis? So I do wonder whether this, and how far, you know, the ways in which these crises, these past crises, especially the financial one, have been not framed as crises, but also the pandemic, but rather as states of exception, in that they do not allow for alternative significations of how things might be, you know? It's just like, this needs to be done, this is necessary, usually in an abundance of metrics that sort of render the imagination as meaningful through, you know, numbers. And numbers say, case numbers, economic numbers, how the future must be, because, you know, the future economy works inevitably like this, or there is no alternative. And I think to re-signify this constant state of exception into crisis in order to be able to imagine how things could be differently, I think forming this condition of possibility is important. And I do believe if we were to look a little closer on what's happening, or what's been happening in the streets, despite sort of the fact that, you know, street politics have been fairly absent due to the pandemic, there is alternatives. They're not utopias in the sense that they are made, you know, they're not blueprints of how things need to be done, but they're rather prefigurative practices, you know, where the visions of the society they want to implement are already informed in their practice, you know, practices based on equality, solidarity, and so on and so forth. In Greece, for example, one of the first infrastructures in the pandemic that was set up during lockdown was sort of a digital infrastructure, a website that helps, for example, the elderly or groups who are vulnerable to get food and access. And this precisely because these knowledges and infrastructures were already in place from the anti-austerity movement before. So I think we can look at this practice because it's already there, and these are not like utopian knowledges in the sense that we need to radically imagine the new that we cannot think of, but also draw from what we already know in this sense and take it seriously, and take also like seriously in question sort of notions of necessity, the freedom of the market, and so on and so forth, and radically, we talked about this, displace them. You know, Maria Bolletz, your colleague, would say make them weird, make them appear to be weird in order to imagine alternatives.
Can I just jump in? Because I think, you know, that is a key point, I think, here. And I mean, the logic of emergency that we've been in, you know, I think all of us, you know, whether we kind of think of the logic of emergency that's now governing responses to the war, previously to the health emergency over the past 2 years, and previous to that, to the financial crisis. And so that immediately forecloses the choices, right? I mean, if you're in an emergency, only certain things are possible, or so the narrative goes, or certain things must be done at whatever cost. And I think it's that foreclosure of, already kind of imagining, I mean, back to your, the very definition of utopias as both, kind of a good place, but also no place. I mean, we lose all of that immediately because it's the logic of, again, what must be done.
Yeah, yeah.
And not in the, Mario Draghi says, but really, although also in that sense. And I think, kind of thinking beyond the kind of grand visions, I think a lot has been happening. And I think that's what we lose sight of. I think there are other projects, that have been going on. The real work is kind of getting done. And I think, even through the years of the pandemic, which has been, which has turbocharged a lot of these processes, whether exacerbating inequalities, whether making other things visible that were always there before. It's just suddenly they were very, kind of glaringly visible. So the role of the state, but also divides. I think we can rethink those openings maybe in different ways.
Yeah, I would totally agree also. I mean, I think what you said about that closing down and that basically the narrative is really reduced to this is what we have to do to get back to, well, the new normal, which was one of those catchphrases in the context of the COVID pandemic and still is, right? Which is, again, say, if not a paradox, I'd say at least it has some tendencies because, of course, these are two opposing terms, right? So what will be new, what will remain normal, so to speak. And this reduction is what I meant with reactionary in both senses, right? So it poses, it says it's basically this is a reaction to an emergency, and we have to do something about this, and this limits our options considerably. But it's also therefore politically also kind of closing out other potential options. Plus, I think what has happened here and what you said about inequalities and inequities for that matter that were exposed, what we also saw and continue to see to an extent is, so to speak, a dark side of, well, yeah, European unification, if you will, or encapsulating, if you look at the global situation there. I mean, inequalities and inequity has risen massively, and as long as the third world countries don't have a vaccination, we will have further variants of the virus. I mean, I'm not an expert. This is basic media knowledge, right? It's very obvious that well, Europe has very much focused on itself. That was, so to speak, difficult enough. I would say that's also part of the narrative, so to speak. And we've forgotten to an extent. Well, to put it very broadly, what happens in the rest of the world. So whenever such emergencies arise, the crisis we were departing from, right? That justifies to look on yourselves in the first place. And that comes with exclusionary mechanisms that are deeply worrying and problematic themselves.
Do you maybe see some other big challenges or crises which we haven't talked about and which are quite important in this?
Well, plenty.
The environmental one, I think we haven't talked much about it yet, and it's one of the big concerns. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, the European Green Deal is one of those, I would say almost utopian narratives, but I'm not sure what you guys think. I would say it's very close to that, and I think it's a great promise and an opportunity. But of course, on the other hand, we also see now with the negotiation, so to speak, or the weighing, like how much can we invest in the military and what goes away from what we were planning to invest in the green funds and so on. This is, I mean, that is clearly a very pertinent and therefore, again, I mean, a global one. But in this sense, I think the European Green Deal is great if it happens, basically.
But, there too, I think it's, a utopia for whom? And, a lot of work is already being done looking at the global effects of the Green Deal, whether it's, who's going to be producing all of our lithium batteries, or kind of dealing with some of the other effects. And so I think there's kind of, we need to think of those geographies, but also how quickly, as you're saying, it's floundered, even kind of been delayed by discussions regarding energy prices. And I mean, it was really interesting. Financial Times, of all papers, had a piece, I think yesterday or the day before, talking about what a bad idea it is for European governments to try to shield consumers against high energy prices, saying, if you're really trying to incentivize reducing consumption, so, then again, questions of, who is protected, where, to what ends, in what kind of time frame. But I think, I mean, and I think that's why it's really important to think of, kind of the scales of this. So really kind of, even though utopias don't have boundaries in the imaginary, they actually do, very clear ones.
Yeah.
I agree. I don't know sort of about the specifics of the Green New Deal, but for example, if you were to look at things that at least are adjacent, such as the, in my field, social economy action plan that the European Commission has recently adopted only in December, and how it's still the production of quasi-markets, that we cannot seem to emancipate ourselves from market-based thinking, or at least tweak it, makes me wonder in how far, these things that are supposed to overcome inequalities draw from the very kinds of knowledges and techniques that produce inequality in the first place. And I think there we do have sort of, to me, obvious limits, and I wonder, what needs to happen for these to be shaken. I mean, if we're talking about consumer protection, I wonder why this is a consumer problem to begin with. Like, I mean, immediately. So these questions do not seem to be visible or not asked enough. And I don't think we don't have the imagination to ask them, but I don't have the imagination to understand why we don't. Sort of.
Because that's the thing, is you're articulating, kind of the answer, the response, or I mean, still within very much within the same logic that produced the problem in the first place. Which, and then again, you say, well, now we are in times of war, so, we cannot think otherwise. Before we were in times of COVID. I mean, we're still in times of COVID, but,
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And about the consumerism, since you referred to my example of the European way of life, like with the previous question, you discussed how much it is only drawing there from the American image of the American way of life and so on. And I think this is really one of the great dangers, where also the crisis of solidarity you briefly addressed beforehand comes together with this kind of, I mean, if the smallest common denominator, as this terminology, as this term European way of life seems to suggest, as I said before, and I'm interested in, like, how can we speak of a European culture? I'm rather skeptical, or I think it's a very contestable term, a very contestable idea for now, that there is a common European culture, but at least there's a term culture in there, whereas in way of life, it seemed to me this has been really completely replaced by, okay, what does this come down to? It comes down to consumption. Basically, I mean, or consumerism, not consumption in the illness sense there. I mean, arguably at the end as well, possibly. But no, I mean, and this is really a crucial. So which way out? Again, if we take together the problem of reduction. So in case in a crisis scenario, we want the one way out, and we have to focus our energy on the one particular way that promises us a way out. And then which way is that? If it's consumerism, I also taking together the ecological questions we were departing from. This is a very bad choice. Yeah.
Can I just jump in, because I think then again it's not only a remedy. The European way of life is not only a remedy for Europeans, but for the rest of the world as well. I mean, because I think this kind of modeling. And, I keep coming back to the narratives around the war right now about protecting, if not European way of life, that's not used, but European values and, whatever those may be. And how do we envision them and what can be done in their name. I think that's what concerns me most. I mean, also because those same values, that same term has been used repeatedly with respect to various migration crises. Yeah, in very problematic ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the so-called migrant crisis, I would say so-called because it's, again, a very contestable term. For me, it's like, it's a term that denominates a European crisis in the first place. And this is indeed one of the crises we have not touched upon too much yet. So also coming back to your previous question, I think it's a crisis, or the term migrant crisis itself is also a bit of a result of a translation from like crisis in people's countries of origin, such as war or persecution or hunger, to a translation into European discourses of, economic fairness, of cultural questions. Above all, I would tend to think of cultural questions. So this kind of culturalization of the discourse that you refer to, that basically we cannot take in people who are too far away from our culture, which is one of those ex negativo constructs of European culture where I always get very skeptical, right? So, I mean, there are right-wing parties, there are radical right-wing movements who claim to speak in the name of Europe nowadays, like the German example that had some limited success in other European countries would be Pegida, right? The patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West, they call themselves. And I mean, if you look at party programs, they all have to have some kind of European take, and many of them are identitarian movement, right? They speak of the one pan-European culture, harking back to colonial ideals, of course. And I think this is one of the problem fields, particularly in the so-called migrant crisis, that you have this culturalization that takes European culture in the rather completely wrong way, obviously, right? So it's a construct where it would be interesting to ask whether this might be considered utopian as well. I wouldn't say so. It's mainly, or the rhetorical gesture, it's mainly about we need to keep and restore what we already have, whatever that might be, basically, from my view.
I don't know if someone can maybe say something about maybe the relationship between peace and utopia, since you all mentioned, especially you, Louisa, you mentioned what's happening and the war, which is so about the concept of peace. How is it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting because peace in discussions about the current war has become a difficult word to use. I won't say a dirty word. But in many ways, yes, because I think, you know, certainly, I mean, you know, there are those in the room who will know the Italian debate very well. And there, I think, you know, calls for peace are also ways, you know, to call for, you know, kind of not recognizing that perhaps this is, you know, a rather unequal conflict. You know? So one part, certainly, of the Italian both far right and far left has used kind of calls for peace as a way, you know, let's say not of appeasement, but certainly, let's say, offering a different geopolitical reading of the conflict. But in terms of imaginaries for peace, I think, you know, and I'll go back to what I said about, you know, Europe's attempts to formulate a different geopolitical vision. I think there we're kind of stuck because, I mean, I think, you know, what are the alternatives, you know, in this precise moment? You know, how do you offer different solutions that are not military ones, that do not, you know, rely solely on a military solution? And yeah, I think there, you know, I find it hard to somehow bring these together.
And what about you, Florian?
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, what I mentioned earlier, the grand meta-narrative of post-World War II Europe was no more war, and as we know, I mean, or no more war on European grounds. I mean, there was these different visions as to whether Europe could also become some kind of in-between bloc between the Cold War powers and try to equalize powers, etc. But at the very least, no more war on European ground. And of course, I I mean, I don't know what else could be done. I mean, we see solidarity, speaking of which we see a lot these days. We see also solidarity, like mixing or intermingling this with the topic we discussed beforehand. If you look at migration flows, what an incredible number of refugees are taken up by the neighboring countries of Ukraine, like Poland in particular. We also see the clashes and overlaps between this and the previous Polish policies, which I think we should not make the mistake of playing them against each other. But we see future conflicts arise here, I would think, in terms of, I mean, why Poland hasn't asked for a European distribution quota is because they know that this would reflect back to them in later discourses, because Poland was one of the countries that has always opposed such a quota beforehand. But again, not to say that this is we cannot play out each other different forms or different solidarities against each other. We should never do that. What I was referring to now was basically, I was trying to analytically frame what is happening there. And to return to the original question, I mean, obviously the peace promise is one of the big utopias there is. And it seems, I'm a bit worried by the militarization in very many European countries, but I don't have a solution there. I don't have even a valid alternative right now.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think that's really important to think about, because also in this moment when we are using, kind of big words like, Europe stands in solidarity, what does that actually mean? And, I mean, going back to Poland, there are people in the audience who know much more about this than I do. But it is quite striking. I mean, Poland has taken in almost 2.5 million people so far. I mean, that's a huge number. I mean, I was in Warsaw, 10 days ago, last weekend, when there was this big event organized actually by the mayor of Warsaw, who also wrote a really interesting piece on The Economist, an editorial on The Economist, saying, in this celebration about what Poland is doing, pay close attention to who's doing what. This is not the state. This is NGOs, individual citizens, religious groups, cities. So, I mean, and, the Polish state has been very good in kind of capitalizing on it, saying, we've opened our borders, our arms, to these people who are our brothers. And in fact, they've been very careful not to use, kind of the term refugees and quotas and so on, because there is a much longer history. But also, be aware of the fact that while people are coming across the Ukrainian border, there's still people dying in the forest on the Belarus border. So, selective solidarity in many ways. So I think there's that. But also, I think, I'm thinking about the work that you've done. I mean, really kind of thinking of what happens in moments of crisis and how people mobilize. And, I mean, cities are incredible for this in terms of, kind of allowing that to happen. But how is it seen? Yeah, I think this is probably easier because this is sagging.
I should have thought of it, sorry.
No. I think, when we talk about these grand, also utopian ideas, I think we really need to place them kind of carefully and think about, who is doing what. So, thank you for the mic, because I think this was a mic.
Do you want to add something, Dimitris? It's not working either? Or?
No, I just set it off. I trust on questions pertaining to war and migration. Luisa and Florian sort of are the experts to speak on, but as for solidarity, I do think, I don't know, one of the things I find interesting is what are the politics of help and what are the politics of solidarity, and how are they, and who is deserving of solidarity and who's deserving and who isn't deserving, and who are those who sort of are in a position to make this judgment. I don't know, this is just one of the questions, because this is certainly something that in movement practice sometimes also comes up.
Yeah, I mean, I rather spontaneously came up with the plural form there, solidarities, what I referred to before, and because, like, intuitively it seemed to me better than, you know, as I said, playing out each other like, okay, I agree with your point. I mean, I heard that the Polish state to some degree offered like housing and other very practical things, but that the major effort was made by the population. And of course, I mean, you can make cultural related diagnosis there as well. I think, I mean, using the term brothers, for instance, as it's very commonly used, and avoiding the other terms there. But this, I mean, the overarching question is like, what does this criticism lead to? And I would never try and say, okay, then we should reduce this help as well. Obviously not. Obviously not. It's more like a try to diagnose what might happen in the future, which new political-cultural problems, conflicts might arise from this particular situation. And coming back to the question of peace, I mean, the peace, I think Zizek, Slavoj Zizek recently wrote a piece about in which he tried to coin a new term for this. So he said, what Russia is currently doing is not Cold War, but it's kind of a hot peace, which I like to an extent. It's like what, and I hope this is not the form of peace that will stick with us, but like there's a constant playing with tensions and how far can we go, and knowing that the NATO is so, I mean, the NATO will hold back and is so very reluctant. So I very much hope that the peace to come won't be such a hot peace in that sense. Yeah.
So now it works. So I think I have to. I'll just hold it,
okay.
Kind of my tiny mic. No, but I think it's interesting. So I've seen the Zizek piece, but it made me think of the term that Mark Leonard from the European Council on Foreign Relations uses, which is unpeace. So he wrote this book, and the CFR has been writing about this. So kind of a condition not of all-out war, which of course it is now, but also not peace, and very much bound up with connectivity and the fact that we cannot. I mean, as we're seeing, I mean, even the attempt to disconnect, we haven't gone very far with that. So I think even kind of thinking of new ways to conceive the condition we're in that are not those of crisis, emergency, and all the things we've mentioned before.
Because you said something about the militarization, that there is obviously that is not the good way, but that there is maybe no other solution right now. How does it interfere maybe with all the utopian narratives? Because it's something coming up from like out of the blue suddenly. There are many countries like militarizing as well in the Nordic countries, stuff you've never have seen some years ago, like Finland example given is there are many people now signing petitions in order to maybe withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty about the personal the anti-personal mines. How do you see?
Or joining the NATO, for that matter, right? I mean, I would think, as I said before, I mean, it's not. I'm also not an expert in military questions, none, really not. So this was like departing from the question of utopia and possibly other solutions. But it is, to come back to what you said, Luisa, before, and it is one of those reductionist narratives where we see, okay, now we will form a new unity. I mean, there are new visions of common European defense policies in case Trump should come back in the US and we cannot rely on NATO anymore. And I mean, this is it's a massive tension, an ongoing tension, and I would say militarization raises. I'm using the term as in a neutral sense, right? Maybe that's a better English term I'm not aware of. So meaning, just investing more money in defensive weapons, and this is hardly ever an only good sign in the history of mankind, very broadly speaking. But I very much agree with your point about the Scandinavian countries. It's extremely difficult to foresee how this will turn out. I mean, from Finland, I understand it's relatively certain that this will happen, in fact, from what I've read so far. And it will be a mix-up, and it will be a different world afterwards. And as I said, I mean, hopefully it will be a proper peace in the original sense of the word, yeah.
And you, Dimitri, or do you?
I mean, again, I don't feel I can add a lot to this, but I was a little sort of struck by how easily, like the language of war sort of proliferated. So suddenly there is 100 billion euros available in defense budget in Germany, and this by a sort of social democratic, green, liberal government. So suddenly this money is there, and we can speak this language, and it's okay. It's like so. It feels like it seems so easy to take sides, and I don't feel like, or maybe I'm missing out. Again, there's an anti-war sort of position in between. What frustrates me, I guess, and this is not an informed but a layperson opinion, is this is opening a door. If we're talking about imaginaries, you know, mobilizing budgets for military spending and speaking the language of the war, and whether we should have anticipated this. I for once, I didn't anticipate this, and I'm quite happy I didn't. I wouldn't want to be that guy who like always has a sort of thinks in terms of threats, and like so I don't know enough about it. Maybe it's like naive, but I'd rather not have that mindset, and I'd rather, in this sense, not have this expectation. I'm afraid this forms certain sets of expectations that have consequences for the future, and I feel, you know, very uneasy about this. But again, this is just a personal take.
Can I just jump into that? And I think I managed to disgrace myself 2 days before the start of the war by going on TV and saying, it's not going to happen. This is just US hysteria. Maybe they will go into the Donbass. So my credentials as a geopolitics expert are shot. But I know I was in good company in the sense that it's certainly in Europe I was not the only one saying it's not going to happen, while the Americans were saying it will happen next Wednesday. It happened the following Wednesday, but nevertheless. But I think, going back to some of the points we were making at the start about foreclosing other possibilities, because I think what really troubles me is that the discussion about mobilizing millions of euros for defense, about taking these really serious new steps, is happening in a moment of emergency. So there is no, kind of discussion. There is no deliberation. It's a reaction to a moment of crisis, which it is. It very much is. So I think, that, again, emergency mode, and, because things have to be done. I mean, if you listen to Josep Borrell, I mean, it is, kind of constantly reiterating that we have to do something. I mean, he's been saying this also before the war. And also, I think the second thing that I would throw in there is, who is making these choices and under what conditions? I mean, I think the interesting thing in the lead up to the war and in the first weeks, to what degree, I mean, even European leaders, or, and I'm talking about EU politicians or national leaders, are being allowed to take different, geopolitical decisions. I think it's really interesting to watch how EU weakness is being portrayed in the US media. And I mean, I just came back from almost a year in the US, spent a lot of it in the kind of defense bubble, and it's, I mean, so do you get to elaborate your own utopias, or?
You meant whether we are, you asked us now, Luisa?
We as Europeans.
Oh, right. Right. Okay, sorry. Yeah. No, I had to think when you mentioned the procedures, I had to think of the German case, indeed, where it's still quite unclear whether the new chancellor kind of came up with the idea in his very close circle, or whether he actually informed his co-chancellor and the leaders of the coalition parties beforehand. And there's this kind of strategical cut. Sorry for the German internal discourse, but I think this fits actually quite well.
I think it fits really well, and it's been happening in other European countries as well. I think.
Yeah. That suddenly you also lose like some, or it's unclear whether some democratic principles are actually upheld, very broadly speaking, right? I mean, and the also additionally disconcerting thing about this was that no one really had an interest to clearly communicate which representatives, or as far as I'm aware at least, which representatives of the government actually took this decision, how much, for instance, the Vice Chancellor knew about this. And yeah, I would agree to this, that we are moving very strongly towards the dystopian realm here, or imaginaries at least, yeah.
I don't know if none of you wants to add anything. Otherwise, we would maybe directly switch into the question from the public. Or do you want to say something?
No, just like, I think this is precisely sort of the crisis of imagination. I feel myself returning to this issue too. I mean, if there's so much that limits, again, what is like stuff from what is possible to what is necessary, from such a position, it's really, really hard to speak. And maybe just, I think this is the problem with thinking through utopias, but then at the same time, when, if not, sort of in times of crisis, and now,
Yeah, that's the point.
So we are a bit running out of time, so if we would directly switch into the questions from the public. If you have some questions, you could raise your hand like you just did. The person in yellow. Someone will come to you with a mic, or should I give mine? Oh, thank you.
We need it for the recording.
Yeah, we do actually.
Yeah, that's fine. Hi, my name is Kees Mulder. I'm a little bit surprised about the labeling of Europe, the European project, as utopia, because it's built on the ruins of World War II, of World War I, and several Franco-German wars. So in that sense, I call it realpolitik, not utopia. I think the utopia is that we thought in Europe that there wouldn't be any more war.
Yeah.
And I've lived in 6 different European countries. I lived outside Europe, and I was scared by that neglect of that issue that we could live in Europe in peace. Full stop. So in that sense, I'm really surprised about the way the discussion is developing tonight, and the labeling and the theme.
Okay, thank you for saying that, because I mean, I think, you know, in a sense, that's been a kind of a question troubling the European project from its start, which, you know, Europe passed its past understanding. So, you know, the no more war discourse, this notion that we, whoever this we is, will build something different on the ruins of the Second World War. And I think one of the things that certainly troubles me is the return, I mean, certainly in the geopolitical sphere, to some of the very same language, you know. I mean, you know, if we have the High Representative for Foreign Policy, you know, I mean, Borrell saying Europe has to learn the language of power, you know, it does, but, you know, what kind of language do we want it to speak? I mean, and, you know, maybe is it even possible, I mean, to develop an alternative project, or, you know, or has this been an illusion? But I mean, there is a long history to this. I mean, really from the 1950s, of peace scholars like Johan Galtung and others writing about this and thinking, you know, can we create a different project for Europe that is not based on hard power, that is something different, and also an alternative in that moment to Cold War discourses. So I don't think, you know, we were, you know, I think I speak for everyone. I don't think we believe in the utopian promise. I would hope, nevertheless, and here I speak for myself, that there could be a different way forward. You know, there are plenty of imaginaries and practices. but we don't seem to be going in that direction.
No. Yeah, I would very much agree. Sorry, did you want to say? No, I mean, as I said in the beginning, Europe is not the utopia. Europe has used, or there have been very many utopian narratives. As I said in the beginning, utopia is a kind of narrative, right? So very many narratives have been used at different stages, different contexts of the European Union. And I would not consider Europe itself to be the utopia. Clearly, Europe is a reality, as messy and complex as it may be, as realities often are. And therefore, the reduction of complexity, which I mentioned in the beginning, comes in. And therefore, some of the initiatives we have been discussing throughout the evening, be it Europeanism from below, so to speak, be it activism, be it finding alternative European futures, non-violent ways of power politics, therefore maybe non-power politics, depending on what notion you use. So that complexity that is Europe needs to be reduced when it comes to talking about Europe and imagining where it's going to be. We cannot foresee, it's like a classical problem in storytelling, we cannot foresee everything possible that will happen. We need to choose a path that we can very well imagine will happen, and then quite often we use this as an argument. If we continue like this, then this will happen and this will be good. But this is a lot of wills and ifs, right? So this is what I meant with saying utopia is a risky narrative. And the question that was kind of pervasive or came up a couple of times, I thought also with what you said, Dimitris, in the end is the quite a provocative question indeed, whether this would be a time where we would actually need more utopias. I'm not saying that I'm agreeing with this. I'm posing it as a question. So the opposite way of what was mentioned before, and the politics of reduction or reaction, so to speak.
Maybe, but I don't know how much time we have. I mean, I feel like we didn't really talk about what makes a utopia, sort of, because I'm thinking it cannot be an exclusionary project, for example, for it to be a utopia. So it needs to be informed by ideas about equality and ideas about inclusivity, certainly not on exclusionary practices, but I feel like we haven't done a lot of seeing what we mean by this.
Well, and, you know, kind of back to the European way of life, if that is to be the utopia, what is it?
No, it won't work. There's a study on that by a French scholar. I just read it the other day. No, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, you can clearly study how people react to this narrative, to this branding, and it's not very promising. Sorry.
Thank you so much. My name is Henriette Baast. And actually, the final three comments already sort of live up to my question, which is that I find our panel very strong, but also very diverse and very European. And as opposed to the sort of the American dream, I think the European narrative of this utopia or our common project maybe has too many narratives, I sometimes think. And you said, don't we need more utopias? And I was thinking, do the panelists have any idea about what maybe their idea of utopia is, or the country that you're from has this sort of ideal? I sometimes feel that in the Netherlands, you know, the sort of the idea of living in this utopia world, which I do think that we are living, is that everything that you do just has to be nice, and as long as everybody gets their latte to go, everything is fine. I mean, maybe I'm being a little bit negative or pessimistic, but I was wondering if the European, you know, panelists have some higher idea about maybe their background of thinking of European utopia.
I mean, I'm not gonna. I think these are interesting issues you touch upon, especially sort of this positive thinking approach to doing stuff. I mean, the latte example, I mean. So here's, I mean, I'm not going to formulate. I don't think this is sort of my role, and I wouldn't feel comfortable, but I will reiterate that it's important to look at the practices that are already going on the ground, and those that we too easily dismiss as, you know, forms of small-scale neighborhood stuff, forms of violence that are not sanctioned. Like these things, I think we also need to consider and look at them and take them seriously. I think one thing that I find very interesting is just as much as sort of we have a crisis of imagination, I think we need to recognize that capitalism, the imaginary of capitalism, again, is in crisis, in the sense that the promises, the virtues that also inform, I think, the European vision, such as fairness, opportunity, or access at least to opportunity, they've been fading. I mean, for a majority of people in Greece, at least this is the case. So this is to say that capitalism works without sort of its ethical promises. I mean, there's scholars who talk about zombie neoliberalism, you know, a Walking Dead man, it's still around, but there's no ethics that are grounded. So maybe this is precisely an opportunity, precisely because the question is, why am I doing this in Greece, for example, for a 500, 600 euro job with like a graduate degree? So what's the point of this? Why am I doing this every day, and then you get fired over the summer and rehired after in order to not be insured? I think if there was anything that I consider genuinely utopian about Europe, and I don't think it's utopian, it's, I don't know, pleasant, I think, in lack of a better word, is the welfare state. To me, at least, this is something that's distinctively different from, I think, whatever the American dream is, that there has been social security and there have been systems in place that protect us sort of from the harshest forms of inequality. And I think to see how this has been fading is really, really frustrating. Greece, I'm going to say this again, I'm sorry, is interesting right now because I feel like what is happening right now in Greece in terms of government is we see an alternative imaginary to the capitalist promise currently forming, and this is sort of the discourse of happiness, you know? So the Greek government is recently really talking a lot about happiness, as in Greeks should be happy, but at the same time they're branding the country as a destination for leisure and happiness beyond tourism, trying to attract sort of digital nomads, creative professionals, and so on. So I think what's great about happiness is it's an end in and of itself. You don't do capitalism competition work. You do this in order to accomplish something else. But with happiness, you don't need a reason. So I think these narratives are important to pay attention to because they reduce a lot of structural critique to self-critique. You know, we're not happy, we're not enjoying this so much, and so forth. So I think these tweaks and twists in the alternatives that are being presented, because I'm convinced, you know, just as much as we discuss alternatives, I think political leaders also sort of feel the urge to formulate alternatives, and we need to see in how far they, again, reproduce at times more of the same.
Thank you. Viva Stålund. I come from Finland, so I have this background of the Nordic welfare state. But somebody has said that a universal basic income would be a practical utopia with steps that you can achieve. And I have of that opinion too. I am a part of the Nordic Basic Income Earth Network, and we have just produced a pamphlet addressed to the government's basic income cornerstone of the Nordic welfare state. And what is important about the basic income, that it gives personal autonomy. And with that, I think the civil society would get us a voice that is now very much restricted by all kind of bureaucratic steering, financing, and so on projects. So, yeah, basic income. And that would leave. And I think really in Greece you have very interesting actions that should be copied also elsewhere.
Thank you for saying that, because I think, you know, so before coming here, I was actually listening to another seminar that was talking about the role of the EU in the MENA region in the Middle East and North Africa. Two colleagues who had been doing work with activist movements, with various political leaders and so on, asking about what, how was Europe and the European model that's supposedly promoted in this region seen? And the thing that kept coming back over and over again was that the kind of democracy promotion in that region was seen as just really kind of bringing a little piece of Europe's promise, because it was stripped of social and economic rights, of, you know, the things that make Europe also not just within, but also in the imaginations of those, you know, kind of seeing it from the other shore, as it may be. And I think, you know, kind of stripping the European project precisely of that, I mean, it hasn't only been about building imaginaries. It also has been about building, you know, societies that, you know, maybe don't guarantee you your latte, but, you know, guarantee you many things. And, you know, I mean, that has been rife with exclusions and limitations and very different across different European societies. But I think that is, I mean, certainly to me, part of, you know, what the European project has been about. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for this web seminar. And my name is Amira Salama. I'm a European Studies student. And I was reading about the external dimension of the EU that has been proposed last year. So talking about migration, do you think that this external dimension of EU border and migration and asylum management is your topic? Because basically it's about giving the power to MENA region countries or Western Balkan countries to manage the migrants for the EU. So is that really possible?
I take it to be a provocative question, right?
Yes.
No, yeah, obviously. No, I mean, this is, again, if I might use that metaphor for the second time tonight, it's, I mean, this kind of outsourcing and stealing away from responsibility is everything but utopian, obviously. I mean, you could say that it's a neoliberal utopia in a way to, like, yeah, outsourcing. What is outsourcing? So if the costs outweigh the effort, and if you define the effort as, if you define the costs, say, as, for instance, also including cultural uproar, like all the cultural clashes we have, as I said before, and I'm actually thinking that the biggest factor in and since the so-called migrant crisis is really culture. Not economic inequalities, which do play a role, doubtlessly, without a question, but I think the biggest factor, if you compare them, is that. And if you raise the stakes and say, okay, this is what we're willing to pay for in the truest sense of the word to get rid of the problem, yeah, I mean, you could say it's kind of a market principle in a way, but of course a deeply distorted and dystopian one most definitely. Don't know, what do you think, Lisa?
No, I mean, I think the questioner knows what I think, but I mean, I will add to that. But I think this embodies precisely, you know, a market mechanism, you know, completely. But one that still has to have, because this is the EU, it still has to have a veil, a packaging of utopia over it. So whether it is, you know, saying that we train the Libyan or any other border guards in European practices, you know, and I mean, there's still the pretense that somehow they are following certain guidelines. So it's not even just, you know, outsourcing, but also, yes, with a particular tinge to it. Which, you know, as we well know, is quite hypocritical. So, but, you know, I mean, that's not, you know, kind of going back to what should the utopia be. Not that. That's, you know, I mean, I don't want to be part of that kind of project. And, you know, once more, kind of thinking how the European project is viewed from outside. I mean, I think this is, you know, very relevant. I mean, the EU and the European community first made of its external dimension a fundamental part of its identity building as well. So we are who we are in our actions in the world. And that has become increasingly so. And, you know, that's not something that I would want, as I said, to be part of my identity.
Yeah. No, yeah. And I mean, if anything, I mean, you wonder whether this is also some part of this politics of scaring away, of cruelty, if you will, as with illegal pushbacks that are tolerated to an extent, and everyone knows about it, and people hope that, or some players hope that this will scare people off. I mean, that pure vision of this happening might very well be, as much as it hopefully never becomes a full reality. If it became, it would be content-wise, it would be horrible, but it would also, the imaginary, as you said, or no, the ideal that we're supposed to spread and to represent, I mean, would be completely, plus would be completely destroyed, plus what I started off with, say, this scaring away effect, this psychopolitics of fear, so to speak. Don't even try and come, because bad things can happen to you and we cannot do anything about it. That is, I would say, another facet of the problem there, yeah.
But I think, you know, again, on the kind of politics of fear, there are alternatives. And I think that's the thing that, you know, I mean, I don't want us to just kind of, you know, because I think that was, you know, part of the questions that are coming up. I don't want us to just, you know, kind of sit here. I think we can unpack, all of us probably in this room, you know, what is wrong with some of these practices and visions. I think it's dangerous to think that somehow we are not able to formulate alternatives, because then again, coming back to the very start of our discussion, we get stuck in, you know, whether an emergency mode, a crisis mode. There are alternatives, and people are practicing those alternatives also at Europe's borders, and they have continued to do so. So, you know, whether in European cities or, you know, at its external borders, this is not all there is and all that there can be. I think that's the important thing to note.
Yeah.
Hi. At some point you mentioned the relationship between peace and utopia, and I wanted to ask you whether you think the European agenda for peace is more leaning towards negative peace or positive peace, and is positive peace too much to ask to the EU, and is it utopic? And yeah, the EU peace agenda is just like negative peace, just like militarization and the absence of violence? Or is it possible to have more like positive peace and structural peace? Does this make sense? I'm sorry.
Yeah, do.
Go for it.
We were just wondering who should explain positive and negative. Maybe you could explain it briefly, because I'm also not aware of the...
You said something about hot peace before.
Yeah, hot. Yeah. That was hot peace. Yeah.
So negative peace and positive peace has been invented by Johan Galtung, and negative peace just means the absence of violence, whereas positive peace means like the establishment of diplomatic relationships after a conflict, overcoming the trauma of the population, ensuring safety in the long term. So it's more like structural peace rather than just the absence of violence.
Which goes back also to, you know, kind of the question about, you know, a social dimension, a social and economic dimension, basically. So it's not exactly, and I think, you know, peace is not just the absence of war and the absence of violence, it's many other things.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree too. When we were talking about peace, like I was thinking about precisely that question, social peace and the violence of precarity. Sort of, I mean, these issues it's a different kind of violence because it's not immediate sort of physical harm in many instances, although not in all. But I mean, these violence sort of forces of everyday precarity and uncertainty and so on and so forth are not discussed in such terms or with these vocabularies. And I think maybe it would be fruitful to reconsider that, because social peace is not a novel concept either. I mean, it's been along a very, very long time, but we just don't use it anymore.
have a question to you, Dimitris. In which way the solidarity you were talking about at the beginning of the conference is more national concept or a European concept? We're thinking about what we had in France, the Gilets jaunes, so the yellow helmet, or what happened in Greece with the demonstration, and in which if there is an evolution in terms of solidarity, or is it like purely a national concept?
I think conceptually it must be neither. I mean, in the sense that if it works through nation or Europe as sort of supranation, then it works through, you know, it has sort of an exclusionary notion in the sense that you define it through particular hierarchies of nation states. So I think in theory there needs to be an equality in place, sort of, and not non-exclusionary practices for it to be solidarity conceptually. So I think, I mean, it must work beyond such concepts. Although I know this is sort of an opinion that's perhaps not very popular, but so that would be a state critique in that sense. And then how far, you know, solidarity also requires nothing in return, right? So, I mean, I think there's obvious limits in the ways in which solidarity is being portrayed, I think, on that level of nation states. And increasingly, again, I think the idea of return or return on investment in that sense makes it something else. It's not solidarity we're talking about, it's being mobilized for other ends. I think this is something that we may, I mean, I think I observe. So I think really between groups, in that sense, beyond ideas of the state, it's like where you see sort of solidarity without wanting something in return. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yes, totally.
Thanks.
Which is very different from the ways in which solidarity has been used at the EU level, which is very much, you know, a kind of tit for tat, you know, kind of, you know, who gives in, and, you know, whether it's the distribution of, you know, the recovery fund or vaccines, you know, take your pick. So we still have some work to do there.
Any more questions? No. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you, and I invite you to share a drink all together, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion and the panel. Thank you.